So I got a Fujifilm X-H2, and for those of you familiar with my channel, you know I primarily shoot the Micro Four Thirds systems from Olympus and OMDS. Starting with the M10 Mark II, and more recently, just about every camera in between, up to the Olympus OM1. And it's still my camera system of choice. It's not going anywhere. The Olympus OMDS system is kind of like my family. I just love them to death. But what a lot of you may not know is that I've been a Fujifilm shooter for a long, long time. And in fact, my very first digital camera was a Fujifilm. And I actually still have it right here. And still works amazingly. The batteries are a little weak. So if I get some new batteries, I think I could take this out and shoot with this no problem. And I upgraded that camera to another Fujifilm, the MX-2700, and and I'm not going to run you through every Fujifilm camera I ever had, but I got three more Fujifilm cameras of a similar ilk. Bridge cameras, action cameras, the little waterproof things. So I'm not new to Fujifilm, but more recently, about 3 years ago, I picked up the Fujifilm X-T30. And again, it was part of FOMO, but in this case, it was for the film simulations and the recipes and things like that. And they were fine. I mean, I wasn't like taken away or swept away by the film simulations, but my biggest problem with the XT30 is I just didn't like the camera. I didn't care for the shutter mode dial on top and the shutter speed dial. I didn't like the little clicky wheels. They felt cheap and plasticky. And the camera itself, with the Q button where it was, I kept hitting that. It was just really an ergonomic nightmare for me, both mentally and physically. The camera didn't fit me, so it was really the wrong camera to begin with. But I was really into this, get the most compact, lightweight camera system with the best quality possible, and the XT30 sort of checked all of those boxes. But then when I started to use it, I never used it again, and it just sat in my dry box for 3 years. There was like maybe 2,000 clicks on the shutter when I traded it in. And then actually, I bought the Fujifilm X100F, and I didn't like that camera either. And then I tried the X Pro 3, wasn't a big fan of that. And these are things I've never really talked about on my channel because, I didn't like them. But I went through my dry cabinet back here and started calling all the cameras that I didn't really use anymore. And that included the Fujifilm X-T30, the Panasonic S5, the Canon M50, and a couple lenses. And I took all that and I traded all in, and I got this Fujifilm X-H2. And I can tell you now, I actually really like this camera. And I wanted to give you my first impressions of using this after about a week. So it's still new to me. And in relationship to the Olympus OM1, which is a terrific camera by any measure, and tell you some of the differences and, pros and cons of each, but mainly talk about the Fujifilm X-H2. Now, I'm sure many of you are already familiar with this camera, so I'm not going to go into detail of all the different specs and everything, but just primarily talk about the things that stood out to me in a both positive and negative way. Now, what stood out to me about this camera and why I got this one over, say, the X-T5 is, this has this beautiful top plate LCD. I really missed that when I used to shoot Nikon. And this also lights up, and it's nice, fancy, like ink display. It also has the normal PASM dial, which, I'm kind of used to. That's kind of how I started with digital photography when I went to interchangeable lens cameras 10 years ago. So my brain is kind of adapted to this kind of workflow. Also, this has the nice grip, say, over the XT5. The cameras, I always end up buying a grip for cameras that don't have a substantial grip already. So the fact that this is built in already is another big reason I chose to say over the XT5. And then the sensor, 40 megapixel aps-c, terrific colors, dynamic range, resolution, all that good stuff. Nothing wrong with the image quality coming from this. And then finally, the lens selection has really expanded as well in the last few years. So, i.e., this Sigma 56mm f1.4 is now available in Fujifilm. They also have the 30 and the 16. And Viltrox is also, from what I understand, making some excellent pro-level glass at very affordable prices. So I'm very excited about the lens selection on this system. Now, I want to talk about some of the negatives of this camera, and it's really very specific to me because I have kind of small hands. but it's this little bump here that comes out on the back of the camera. And I guess this is so you can hold the camera this way like a gangster. I mean, you really shouldn't hold your camera like this, but this is comfortable. But my problem is when I want to have access to the shutter button and the joystick at the same time, I have to hold the camera like this, and now this is digging into my palm, and it's really uncomfortable. So what I have to do is shift my wrist down a little bit so I can hold the camera like this. Now this is perfectly fine, but now I don't have access to the joystick very easily. This is just a little bit out of reach. So what I have to do is loosen my grip and shift my wrist up so I can access the joystick, and then I have to go back down to tighten my grip back again to be able to push the shutter button. So this was almost a deal breaker for me. And if you have small hands, or anyone really, you should make sure that this is not going to be a problem for you like it is for me. Now, the other thing I had to get used to was the button layout, because you'll notice on this camera that there's three buttons right here on top, and then there's a record button here. Now, the record button and the shutter button are very convenient, and I like that part. I like the on-off switch here, being on the shutter button itself. I like that a lot too. But these three buttons here, I can't really access with my index finger without loosening my grip to push these. And then even if I do get access to them by loosening my grip, the camera strap is going to get in the way of accessing these three buttons. So what I found was the way to operate these three buttons is really with your thumb. You have to loosen your grip to come up and adjust. This is set to what, ISO and white balance, and then this is customizable here. So this workflow, again, requires you to, or at least me, to loosen my grip to be able to access these three buttons. Now, compared to the OM1, for example, when I hold this camera like this, you can see that my index finger has easy access to the two buttons here on top without having to go around the camera strap or using my thumb. And then the joystick over here is recessed or placed much lower down, so I have easy access this way to this button or the joystick, and also to the AL button and the AF on button. And then the function lever here is easy to switch up and down. It's all within easy access because this is a little bit smaller camera. So I don't really have to loosen my grip very much or change my wrist position to access any of these buttons. So what this means is you can basically operate the camera almost entirely with your right hand, because you can hold the camera with your left hand like this. So as you're panning or tracking something, you have access to all of the buttons with your right hand, and you even have access to the mode dial that has the custom functions. You can do that all very quickly on the fly as you're out shooting. Now let's just compare this to the Fujifilm, and let's just assume that this is not a problem for me, that my fingers are long enough. Even so, if I want to access any of the buttons on top, I have to loosen my grip quite a bit to get up here to do that. And then if I want to change mode, say from aperture to shutter priority or to one of the custom modes, I have to let go of the camera with my left hand, come up and make the adjustment, and then come back this way. And then compared to, say, the OM1, you can see that even if I have to change the mode dial to a custom mode, I loosen my grip quite a bit with my right hand, but I can maintain that stability with my left hand and elbow tucked in this way and do this. Now, a couple of minor things I do like about the Fujifilm exterior here is I like this click to open memory door here and the click to open battery door here. I just find that easier than the OM1, where it's kind of this slide and snap out, then slide and snap back in. And the battery door is sort of the slide the lever down to open, and then close it and slide this up. That's not too bad, but this door I'm not crazy about. I much prefer sort of click to open. And then speaking of memory, this uses a CF Express B type card and a UHS2 SD card, so it's kind of mixed match. Now, some people have complained about that, but for me, it's not a problem because I always use two memory cards and I never take one memory card out. It's always in the camera. So it's like a built-in internal memory from my perspective. So when I get home from a photo shoot, all I have to do is take out one memory card to unload all my photos, and then I put it back in when I'm done. And if I happen to forget to put it back in, if I go out in the field and I forgot to put that one back in, I still have the one that I never take out. And I do the same thing on the OM1, but the only difference being is this is a dual SD card slot. And I set up the memory configuration, so it's always writing, dual to both cards at the same time. So I always have a backup, and then when I put the memory card back in and I go in the field, I can always just reformat both of them once I've safely offloaded them onto my computer. All right, now let's get into some direct comparisons between the OM1 and the X-H2. Now, I put a posting up last week asking, what do you guys want to see? So I did my best to try to answer some of those and these comparisons. So we're going to be looking at resolution between 40 megapixels and 20 megapixels, also between 40 megapixels and the high-res shot modes between 50 and 80 megapixels. And I'm also going to sprinkle in some comparisons with the Panasonic S1R, which is a full-frame 47 megapixel camera. I did have it for a couple of weeks, but I ended up returning it because it was just too big and heavy. But you'll see some of the results from that camera as well as a comparison. But first, let's just get the video specs out of the way because I'm not really a video guy. My focus here is really on the photography side of these cameras. But when it comes to video, the X-H2 basically blows the OM1 out of the water because, it can do 8K, ProRes, RAW, 422, 10-bit. I'm sure there's plenty of reviews online about how the X-H2 performs as a video camera. And they'll do a much better job than I ever could. For my needs, even professionally, the 10-bit 420 output recorded internally on the OM1 is more than enough. But if you do need better video capability, you may want to seriously consider the X-H2. Now, one of the first tests I did with the camera was for video autofocus, and this is back when I still had the S1R. But you can see if you stay in the frame and you just walk towards the camera slowly or walk away from the camera, all three of them actually did a pretty good job with, maintaining autofocus, maintaining exposure properly. It's only really like here when I walk out of frame and come back in the frame is when you see the S1R is just a little slower here, but it's much slower sometimes, like what's about to come up here. You can see that the S1R is just struggling to reacquire focus. It eventually gets me, but it's not anywhere near the performance of the other two cameras. Now, with respect to the OM1 and the X-H2, it's really going to depend on the settings because there's multiple settings here. But the way I have it set up now is the focusing is snapping pretty quickly on the OM1 and a little bit more gradual on the X-H2. But really, either camera I think is perfectly fine for this kind of headshot video. And this is just a quick image stabilization test where I'm holding the camera at arm's length and just walking out to the back of my yard and then turn around and come back. And, we have no stabilization on the top left and then the various stabilization modes of the other cameras across the screen. And I was using basically the 50 millimeter equivalent field of view. So I was using the 50 millimeter on the S1R, the 35 millimeter f2 on the X-H2, and the 25 millimeter f1.8 on the Olympus. Now, ignore my color grading here. The differences here can all be ironed out in post-processing, but I think in this test here, the OM1 is clearly doing the best job at stabilizing the footage as I'm walking around on my very lumpy backyard. Now that's all I've done for video testing because it's not really my forte. If you need more sophisticated video testing, you really need to check out other channels that compare the X-H2 specifically against other video-centric type cameras because the specs on this just blow the OM1 out of the water with 8K and 422 10-bit. You'll need a CF Express card to take advantage of some of those features, but if you need a video-centric camera, it definitely beats the OM1 in that respect. Now when it comes to autofocusing, again, my test here is a very simple one, just talking head type shots. And I think both cameras in that regard perform admirably and competently. And I would say they were about equal. But if you need more sophisticated autofocusing testing in video, you'll have to check out another channel for those kind of reviews. Now, when it comes to image stabilization, I think clearly the OM1 had the best here. And I didn't have any scenario where I found the X-H2 was able to beat the OM1 when it came to image stabilization. But it's not bad on the X-H2, but definitely the OM1 is better. All right, now let's talk about autofocus on these cameras, and we'll start with the subject detect or animal detect on both cameras with continuous autofocus, continuous shutter. And on both cameras, you really have to get the animal a certain size in the frame before it picks them up. But overall, the OM1 did a better job, I think, than the X-H2. Now, when I was doing portraits with eye detect, again, I feel like the OM1 was doing a better job here, specifically on one particular set of images. And even though I got eye detect on my dog here, a lot of times on the XH2, it didn't actually focus on the eye. As you can see here, it's struggling, and it's partially because, she has black eyes on black fur. I think any camera will kind of struggle with that. But definitely the OM1 was showing a better performance for the animal detect with eye detect. Because when she's laying down like this is where it specifically was the XH2 was challenged. It missed, roughly a third of the shots when she was laying down on the ground like this. Even though I had the eye detect box on her eyes, a lot of the images were not in focus, whereas the OM1 was. And you'll see that in the numbers I'm going to show you here in the table. Now, I also did some shots of her running back and forth for some action shots, and she was pretty small in the frame most of the time. So I only counted the ones where the camera started to pick up the autofocus, and then I counted all of the ones from the first autofocus point to the last one. And the hit rate was about the same on both cameras in this scenario. So here's an example of how I did it. I threw a frisbee, and then she would come running back to me most of the time. Sometimes she would run the other way. She's a character. But you can see here, this is the OM1. It picks her up pretty well, and then as she gets closer to the camera, it starts to pick up on her head and then also on her eyes if she gets close enough. And the XH2 put in a similar performance, at least on camera here when I was recording. But in practice, when I actually counted them off, the numbers were still pretty similar. So let's take a look at those. Now, here are the numbers from that day, and I've taken several hundred more since then, and I'll elaborate more on that in a minute. But basically, you can see that the OM1 and XH2 were actually very similar in performance. However, this is where the XH2 really kind of let me down. It was really struggling with her when she was laying on the ground. And you can see I took a lot more shots here with the XH2 than I did with the OM1 because my confidence level when I was looking through the EVF was not that high. I was not seeing that box around her eye as often. So I took more pictures so I could get the eye in focus. And it turns out when she's sitting down, it was actually doing a good job. But when she was laying down, as you saw in the previous part of this video, this is where it really struggled. So they need to do some more work on that. Now, the S1R is a very slow camera, and it would not focus at all on her when she was running. And when she was sitting down, it does have animal detect, but it really only detects the head of the animal. It doesn't necessarily always catch the eye. And this is the primary reason I return it because, that's why I got into photography is take pictures of my pets. And the S1R, despite its wonderful resolution and colors, it really struggled to focus here. Now, I want to elaborate. I was simply doing spray and pray on these cameras, selecting all focus points and letting the camera do all the work. Your hit rate's going to be a lot higher if you can just choose a smaller focus area, if not a single point, particularly with the S1R, and choose the focus point yourself. You'll get a much better hit rate with any of these cameras. Now, let's talk about the image quality on the X-H2 because one of the things that attracted me to it was the new 40 megapixel sensor. And a lot of you asked me, how does that native 40 megapixel sensor compare to, say, the high-res shot modes that we can do on our Olympus cameras, like the 50 megapixel and the 80 megapixel high-res shot modes? And long story short, there's really not that much difference. When you put the camera into high-res shot mode, the image quality is pretty comparable, if not better in some ways, than the native resolution at 40 megapixels. Now, the X-H2 also has a high-res shot mode, which is practically unusable. And I'll talk about that as we're looking at these images. So let's get started. So what I did is I took a picture of this tree in my backyard and then I cropped in. So what we're looking at here is the Olympus native 20 megapixel image. This next one is the Fujifilm 40 megapixel native image. This next image is the high-res shot mode for Fujifilm at 160 megapixels. And then finally, we have the 80 megapixel high-res shot mode from the Olympus camera. I also set up a prop here in my studio of this hard drive and electronics, and this is the native OM1 at 20 megapixels, and then coming up is the 40 megapixel native from the X-H2, and we do see a nice bump in detail here. And then this is the high-res shot mode, which I don't really see a lot of improvement here. And then here's the high-res shot mode, where I do see a significant improvement over the 20 megapixels. Now, I don't expect you to tell much difference by watching this in a video, so I posted a album to my Flickr page where I've put these images in so that you can pixel peep them, for yourself and see the differences. But let me tell you what I have found so far. Now, to really see the difference of the 40 megapixels in X-H2, you have to have a really good lens. Now, Fujifilm has a list of like 20 lenses that supposedly can resolve those 40 megapixels, but they don't say if they can resolve the 160 megapixels. And what I found is that this 35 millimeter f2, which is on their list of approved lenses for 40 megapixels, uh, really wasn't resolving even all 40 megapixels, in my opinion, and certainly not the 160 megapixels. However, when I got this 50 6 millimeter f1.4 from Sigma, I definitely saw a marked improvement in the image quality, even at the 40 megapixel range and also at the 160 megapixel range. And again, those images will be on my Flickr page so you can check them out. But you will see a pretty stark difference between these two lenses doing 160 megapixels in particular. Now, the high-res shot modes on the Olympus, it actually is pretty linear. 40 megapixels on the X-H2 is being out-resolved by the 50 megapixel high-res shot mode on the Olympus, and the 160 megapixel image from the X-H2 is actually about the same as the 80 megapixel image on the Olympus. So it seems like this high-res shot technology is better implemented in camera on the OM1, because the Fujifilm, you actually have to take 20 pictures and then bring those into an app it's free from Fujifilm to actually combine all those images to create the 160 megapixel image. So it's not a smooth process like it is on the OM1. You set it up to take the high res shot, so it takes 20 shots. Then you load those 20 images onto your computer, load them into the app. The app puts them together to create the 160 megapixel image, and then it creates a separate DNG file. Versus the OM1, it's all in camera, even handheld at 50 megapixels. So it's really a much better implementation. Now, the reason I said the high-res shot mode is practically unusable in the X-H2 is not, number one is the workflow is terrible, and then number two is if anything moves in the frame, it creates these artifacts. And what doesn't move in nature, right? So for landscapes, you're going to have artifacts all over your image, just like in this tree here. It's virtually unusable. Even in the studio on a tripod, I had to do it 3 or 4 times before I got one decent, high-res shot mode, even indoors on my tripod, where I thought everything was stable, but apparently my house moves 1 or 2 pixels every couple of seconds. Now, one more thing I want to add, and this might stir up some debate, but when you're looking at a 40 megapixel image and a 20 megapixel image, it's extremely difficult to tell the difference between the two when you're looking at them in a normal way, meaning you're looking at them online, whether it's Instagram or Flickr or, printing them out on, 8 by 10. In these situations, the extra megapixels are kind of wasted. The only time it might make a difference really is if you have to crop in a lot and you need very, very fine detail. Potentially like in product photography, like I was doing the electronics. These kind of things I could see the higher resolution having some practical application. But for taking pictures of my dog, doing landscapes or just some of my architectural photography that I do professionally, the 20 megapixels is more than enough. Now, another question I got was about like dynamic range, pushing and pulling highlights and shadows, noise performance. And again, I'm getting very, very similar performance between the two cameras. One wasn't really any better than the other. The noise in the images look about the same. The highlight recovery was really about the same. I might give a slight edge to the Fuji, And the shadow recovery was roughly the same in terms of noise reproduced. And, DP Review has a great interactive site for comparing things like this. But in my testing, I didn't see much difference between the two. And if you apply any kind of noise reduction to the image, it pretty much mitigates any differences completely between these two cameras. Even against my when I used to have the S1R with its 47 megapixel sensor, uh, it just didn't make much difference. The noise performance pretty much the same. And I posted another comparison shot just like that at ISO 51,000 onto my Flickr page so you can see for yourself. All right, so this video is getting a little long, so let me just try and summarize what I really think about this camera. And to be honest, I really didn't like it the first couple days I had it because I wasn't seeing the increase in resolution that I was expecting. I wasn't getting the ISO performance or the dynamic range, all of that stuff that I talked about. There was not really much difference, if any, between my OM1 and this X-H2. It's just this is a much bigger, heavier camera, relatively speaking. But once I was able to kind of wrap my head around the workflow of this camera, because I was struggling with the menu systems and the buttons, I was trying to say, how do I get this button to do that? Or how do I get the, because my thinking was still Olympus or OM systems, because this camera is really all about customizing the buttons and dials, the levers, setting up your custom modes, and then diving into the menu to do a few other things. Uh, that's how this camera works, and this is how I use the camera. With the Fujifilm, you really don't need to reprogram these buttons and dials. I mean, you can, it's very customizable, but the way they are set by default is perfectly fine. The key to using this camera is really, for me, the quick menu. Because what it does is it brings up a bunch of icons that you can program to access any of the features and settings that you want in the menu. So you don't have to deep dive into the menu every single time you want to change a setting. You just set up your quick menu and push the Q button and use the D-pad and dials to kind of navigate around that and make quick changes so that you can just go on and keep shooting. Now, another key difference that changed my mind about this camera was getting the Sigma 56 1.4. Because before that, I was using the 35 f2. I have an 18 to 55 2.8, and I got, a couple other cheap lenses and some adapted lenses. But none of those really brought out the best that this camera can do. And after seeing the images that I got using this 56, I was like, oh, finally some images I actually really like to look at, because the color, the contrast, the sharpness, and everything like that really made a big difference in what I think about this camera. And that's so important. And that's really one of the biggest reasons I fell in love with the Olympus systems, because even the normal primes, the 45-1.8, the 25-1.8, all of these lenses from Olympus, I've never been disappointed. Every single one I have has brought out something very, wonderful from these cameras. And it's easy to kind of overlook the lenses when, these cameras have so many features, but it's really the most important thing. And that's the only reason I still have this camera today, is because I got this lens. And I think over time, once I kind of get into this Fujifilm culture of, using the film simulations and the recipes that everyone's talking about, I think I can really start to enjoy this camera and maybe even learn to love this as much as I love my Olympus cameras. And who knows, one day maybe this will become a permanent part of the Rob Trek family. So I hope you found this video helpful. Look forward to maybe some more tutorials on this camera. Again, if you're interested, let me know in the comments below. But for now, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.